You're about to hear something almost no one is brave enough to admit. My name is your name, and for decades I lived under a man who ruled not with words, but with invisible authority, a grip so tight it could make entire lives bend to his will. I learned young how to obey, how to earn approval, how to survive, and how systems of power really work, but life has a way of testing what you think you understand. One Christmas at a single table, I saw the truth: authority is fragile. History repeats itself quietly, invisibly, and it can be dismantled by those who are patient enough to watch, precise enough to act, and fearless enough to see it for what it really is. This story is not just about a family. It is about patterns older than us, forces you encounter every day, and the dangerous knowledge that can change everything once you understand it. Today, I will show you how to see the invisible currents and how to reclaim what you thought you never could. The scrape of wood against the floor, it's a sound you never forget. That first moment, sharp, metallic, a noise that slices through the laughter, the holiday chatter, and lands like a secret no one was meant to hear. My daughter, only 9, stumbled backward. Not in play, not by accident. The force came from my own father. His hand, rigid and cold, pushed her like she was a shadow, a placeholder, an unworthy claimant to a chair he had already decided belonged elsewhere. "This seat," he said, his voice deliberate, slow, "is for my real grandchild. Not a joke. Not a fleeting thought. Those words were etched into the room like a curse, permanent and undeniable. And in that instant, I realized history doesn't just sit quietly. It strikes, often when innocence is present, when trust is highest, when our very assumptions about family, legacy, and authority are most vulnerable. I didn't move immediately. I didn't scream. I watched the air leave her. Small body, too light to make a sound as she hit the floor. There was a mercy in her collapse. Her head didn't bounce, but the room had changed. The air had thickened. Every eye, every heartbeat, every fork suspended above the plate paused in recognition of what had just occurred. My father's hand hovered, frozen mid-command. For the first time, perhaps in decades, he felt powerless. Not physically, not yet, but the universe shifted beneath him, and he didn't know it. I had worshipped him. Once, he was gravity. Everything revolved around the axis of his approval. As a boy, I had learned to earn it with obedience, with achievements, with carefully measured love. That system had worked until it didn't. That moment, my daughter hitting the floor, was the first crack, the first glimpse of the machinery behind the veneer of civility. Power, as he knew it, demanded loyalty and bloodline above everything else. And that belief had set in motion centuries of patterns, fear, control, inheritance, suppression, and the kind of cruelty only disguised in family tradition. This is where most people stop seeing, where they think it's just a quarrel, a familial spat, a difficult father. But history, even intimate, personal history, is always bigger than us. It is layered, conspiratorial, often coded in the gestures we are trained to ignore. The push wasn't about Christmas. It wasn't about a seat. It was about legacy, purity, control, ancient ideas passed down through time, now landing violently in a 9-year-old's world. And that is where the descent begins. You think you know your family. You think you know your place. But some truths, those dangerous, forbidden, corrosive truths, require you to watch everything crumble before you understand them. He didn't see her as a child. He saw interruption, a threat, a variable he could not control. That is the essence of these kinds of power systems, whether in families, governments, or secretive institutions. They thrive on predictability. They rely on obedience, tradition, and the silent accepting. E of hierarchy. Every laugh, every gesture, every smile that deviates from expectation becomes a fault line. And when that fault line appears, the response is swift, precise, and merciless. I learned to read him early. Every conversation, every glance, every subtle correction had been cataloged, indexed, and stored. That's how control works. It's slow, insidious, almost invisible until it's too late. My daughter didn't have that training yet. She simply existed. And for that, she became a target. Not for misbehavior, but for the truth she represented. Blood cannot always dictate loyalty. Innocence cannot always bend to expectation. Love cannot always be quantified. I didn't rush to her. That would have been noise, chaos, a surrender to the emotional currents that these men, the ones who build their empires on fear and legacy, use against you. I stood, I watched, and in that stillness, I understood the moment for what it was, not an act of malice toward a child, but a rehearsal of centuries of human behavior. The push, the words, the authority. It was a ritual of dominance, passed down from father to son, grandfather to grandchild, as if morality could be inherited alongside the family name. History hides in these gestures. The small, invisible violences are often the ones that define the path of an entire lineage. Wars are waged in corridors, in whispered orders, in property lines and testaments. And here it was, mirrored in a domestic dining room, a microcosm of control and inheritance, with stakes that were just as high as any battlefield. The lesson was clear: submission is demanded, defiance is punished, legacy is preserved. Above all else, I cataloged everything silently. Every word he uttered, every nuance, every movement of his eyes became evidence, not for the moment, but for the reckoning that would follow. Because understanding power is the first step toward dismantling it. You cannot fight what you do not comprehend. And the deeper you go, the more you see the machinery behind what the world calls normal. The smiles, the traditions, the rules, they are often illusions carefully curated to maintain control. By the end of that evening, the table remained set, the wine still glinted under the chandelier, but the room was a different place. The balance had shifted. One push, one statement, and suddenly the invisible threads of history were exposed. And for the first time, I realized the depth of the work ahead: to protect the innocent, to dismantle inherited tyranny, and to awaken the consciousness of those who believed family loyalty could excuse brutality. My father was not cruel by accident. That's a misconception people make when they encounter someone like him. They call it temper or pride or rigidity. No. Cruelty can be taught, refined, and perfected. He learned it from his own father, a man who understood that power is inherited not just in wealth, but in fear, obedience, and memory. Every word, every gesture, every correction in my childhood was part of a training system, subtle, invisible, yet relentless. You learned early which questions to ask, which opinions to suppress, which love was conditional. And now, as I watched him push my daughter, I saw the same pattern repeat. History, I realized, doesn't only happen in the world outside. It repeats at the family table, quietly, deliberately. Power has a way of convincing its holders that love is irrelevant, that loyalty, blood, and obedience are the only currencies that matter. My father's obsession with real bloodlines wasn't sentimental, it was strategic. He had studied systems like this his entire life: empires, dynasties, institutions, and internalized the lesson that survival requires exclusion. Those who cannot serve the narrative must be erased, displaced, or devalued. And there she was, 9 years old, temporarily assigned to his orbit, threatening the purity of the narrative he had built for decades. I cataloged the moment carefully. There is a method to understanding power. Notice the words, the emphasis, the repeated patterns. In his declaration, "This seat is for my real grandchild," he revealed more than disdain. He revealed the architecture of his mind: hierarchy above love, legacy above family, bloodline above humanity. And this is what the world rarely admits. People are not merely individuals. They are vessels for history, patterns, and systems. My father's actions were part of a chain that stretched back generations. Understanding that chain is not optional if you intend to survive, let alone reclaim what is yours. The room fell silent, but history did not. It settled over the table like a shroud, suffocating yet clarifying. Guests froze, unsure of whether to intervene or pretend nothing happened. Silence, after all, is a mechanism of control, one I had seen employed countless times. In these moments, complicity is baked into behavior. People are taught to look away, to avoid acknowledging injustice, because acknowledgement threatens their own place in the system. But I did not look away. That night, I became a witness to the architecture of authority, and the responsibility weighed like stone on my shoulders. I realized something else: anger alone is useless. Fury may feel righteous, but it is loud, ephemeral, and easily dismissed. Justice requires patience, precision, and strategy. Every step I would take had to be calculated. The emotional response, the immediate confrontation, the scream of a child, it would have been theater. And theater never dismantles systems, it merely entertains them. Real power shifts quietly, invisibly, and lethally. That is the first lesson the room whispered to me. That evening, power can be stripped not with noise, but with preparation, knowledge, and deliberate action. Even as he stood there satisfied with his authority, I began my analysis. His gestures, his phrasing, even the placement of wine glasses on the table revealed a lifetime of rehearsal. Every action was a layer of armor around his perception of control. And just like empires, these fortresses can crumble, not through brute force, but by exploiting the architecture from within. The first observation, the first awareness, is always the most dangerous moment for the oppressor. They do not yet know you are awake. My childhood gave me an education no school could provide. I had spent years decoding the subtle hierarchies of family life, identifying patterns, and learning how compliance and manipulation intertwined. My father's lessons were cruel, but they left a blueprint. I understood what made him tick, how he valued authority over morality, and how a single misstep could destabilize his carefully curated image. When he pushed my daughter, he activated everything I had spent a lifetime observing. But this time, I was ready. I was no longer the child who feared the gravitational pull of his approval. I was the one who could see the machinery and planets collapse. Power, I realized, is obsessed with permanence. Those who wield it fear impermanence above all else, fading relevance, loss of control, exposure. My father's insistence on real grandchildren was not sentiment, it was preservation. He had built an empire of self-importance reinforced by compliance, rituals, and documentation. Every family gathering, every correction, every dismissal was a reinforcement of a system that had endured decades. And yet even systems, the seemingly immutable, have weaknesses. The smallest slip, the faintest trace of oversight, can become the lever that topples them. I cataloged, I recorded, I analyzed. Every email, every offhand comment, every legacy clause in his meticulously drafted documents was evidence waiting for the right moment to be weaponized. The push was not the climax, it was the invitation. An invitation to awaken, to dismantle, to reclaim. For years I had observed, but now observation had a purpose. The chessboard was set, every piece, every strategy, every nuance was waiting for the first calculated move. That evening, the quiet of the room was no longer oppressive. It was opportunity. That night, I began to see my father not as a man, but as a system. Every rigid movement, every authoritative tone, every expression of disdain was a protocol, a function designed to maintain hierarchy. The push at the Christmas table wasn't impulsive. It was the output of decades of conditioning, a machine that measured loyalty, blood, and utility and expelled what didn't fit. And systems, even those built by humans, have weaknesses. They can be outmaneuvered. They can be dismantled quietly, precisely. But first, they must be observed, understood, cataloged. Power hides in plain sight. People mistake it for personality, for temperament, for instinct. But it's neither. It is structural. It relies on patterns repeated over generations, obedience, fear, the unspoken rule that questioning authority is dangerous. And my father had spent a lifetime teaching everyone in his orbit these rules. I had learned them too. But now I knew the loopholes. I knew where authority bends, where control fractures, and where justice can infiltrate a system that seems invincible. I did not speak. I did not act. I recorded. I observed. The room had become a theater, each participant playing a part scripted long before I arrived. My daughter, innocent and unaware, was the catalyst. My father, authoritarian and self-assured, had just revealed the mechanisms of his power. And I, patient, calm, calculating, had the perspective to dismantle it. That is the essence of forbidden knowledge, understanding the architecture of control before striking, rather than reacting emotionally. Those who act on impulse are crushed. Those who act strategically reclaim what is theirs. The emails arrived quietly, a breadcrumb trail hidden in digital shadows. Forwarded from my mother, addressed to distant relatives, detailing inheritance clarifications. Bloodline only, the message read. Temporary arrangements, she typed. Every word was a brick in the fortress he had built around his perception of legacy. Every phrase a reminder that some truths are engineered to exclude, to manipulate, to suppress. And now, as an observer and participant, I could see the entire blueprint. I could map the system. I could dismantle it piece by piece. History teaches the same lesson repeatedly. Those who wield authority often assume permanence. They underestimate the consequences of arrogance. They fail to anticipate strategy. And in families, as in empires, that failure is fatal. My father believed his word was law, that tradition and fear would shield him. But knowledge is a weapon, and I had it. I reached out to lawyers, specialists in elder assets, trusts, and institutional oversight. Every conversation was tactical, designed not to provoke, but to verify, confirm, and prepare. I learned which accounts required dual signatures, which properties were leveraged, and which charitable foundations were facades hiding the true architecture of wealth and influence. Every detail he had assumed secret became visible. Every misstep, every overconfidence was now evidence. The push at Christmas was a signal, not the problem. The problem was the system itself, and systems can be defeated when you understand their internal logic. I began recording conversations, not traps, not deceptions, but confirmations. He spoke freely, arrogantly, believing power still made him untouchable, and in those words I found the blueprint for the undoing of his empire. Every casual dismissal of my daughter, every reference to non-blood liabilities, every explanation of hierarchy, it was all cataloged. It all became leverage. History repeats itself, but only for those who fail to observe its patterns. For those who do, it becomes strategy. The Christmas table, once a place of tradition, became a courtroom. My father did not know the law had already been called in, not through sirens, not through force, but through preparation, patience, and understanding of the hidden mechanisms of power. When authority is stripped of its invisibility, it falters. When knowledge is applied with precision, it becomes justice. And what unfolded next was a lesson in the quiet, deliberate dismantling of a man who believed his place in history was unassailable. That night I realized control is a fragile illusion. Observation is the first act of liberation. Power migrates in patterns you cannot always see. My father had built his authority on fear, obedience, and the illusion of permanence. But permanence is a myth. Everything has a weakness, especially systems engineered by men who overestimate themselves. I had spent a lifetime observing, cataloging, preparing, and now every piece of that preparation began to converge. His arrogance was the key. Every casual remark, every derisive comment about my daughter, every subtle correction of her behavior became an internal ledger of liabilities he could not control. And that ledger would be the instrument of his undoing. He believed the room obeyed him. He believed tradition and the weight of history were shields strong enough to withstand defiance. But he had not accounted for calculation, patience, and strategy. Knowledge is a weapon. Observation is leverage. Silence is preparation. That night, the table was no longer a stage for his authority. It was a chessboard, and I had already moved my pieces while he celebrated his illusion of control. I contacted the board of his foundation, carefully, innocuously at first. Each question measured, each interaction deliberate. My father had spent decades assuming loyalty, assuming his word alone commanded obedience. The board believed in protocols, rules, and governance. They were not immune to the same systems of hierarchy, but they were not blinded by the personal mythology that had fueled his empire. As I spoke, they heard his intentions, his language, his contempt, and the cracks began to widen. Power, when exposed, trembles. When it is challenged methodically, it begins to unravel. And history repeats itself, often in silence, often in small, calculated interventions. I did not confront him directly. That would have been mercy. Mercy in these systems is weakness. Justice is quiet, deliberate, and inevitable. I prepared, I positioned, and I waited. The moment of exposure must be undeniable. The evidence must be irrefutable. Authority that is unchallenged in its domain remains untouchable. Authority challenged through precision collapses under its own weight. And my father's authority, built on fear, tradition, and selective loyalty, was ripe for dismantling. The mechanics of power are often invisible. They are embedded in documents, in emails, in the careful wording of legal clauses. My father's will was a revelation. Temporary arrangements, bloodline only. Every exclusion, every hierarchy, every caveat became a tool. Observation had prepared me to see the system from inside and outside simultaneously. This is the dangerous knowledge most never attained, seeing the architecture of authority and knowing how to turn it against its creator. It is not vengeance, it is reclamation. It is the restoration of balance in a system corrupted by obsession with control. This is where many would falter. The temptation is to act too early, too emotionally. But the law, like history, rewards strategy and patience. I cataloged, recorded, consulted, verified. Each step was deliberate, every move measured against the blueprint I'd compiled over months, years even. And then, like the pendulum of inevitability, the system began to bend. The board acted, the trust responded, the structures my father believed eternal began to migrate elsewhere. Authority is fluid. It shifts to those who understand its architecture and are willing to claim it with precision. And that is exactly what I prepared to do. The room remained unchanged outwardly, the same chant. Elayer, the same table, the same glasses, but underneath everything had shifted. Power, I realized, is never in what is visible. It's in the hidden currents, the unspoken rules, the assumptions, the invisible scripts that everyone believes are eternal. That night, my daughter's small body on the floor had cracked one of those scripts. And now, the machinery my father had relied on for decades, the belief that obedience equals survival, was beginning to fail. I watched him carefully, noting every flicker of confusion, every subtle tremor of authority fading under the weight of unseen strategy. He did not yet know the storm was coming, and that is the advantage of patience. I played the recordings for the first time weeks later, choosing a moment when the room could not ignore them. His own voice, calm, deliberate, cruel, filled the space. Plans to cut off non-blood liabilities, dismiss those who threatened his narrative, and preserve the so-called purity of his legacy. He had believed his words were private, hidden behind centuries of assumed loyalty. But secrecy, like power, is fragile. And the truth, once revealed, carries its own authority. My mother's wine glass shattered, my brother froze, and the illusion of command that had guided him for decades collapsed in silence. Authority is a house built of perception. Destroy perception and the structure falls. The board acted first and subtly, like history itself. They removed his name, froze accounts, triggered clauses in the trust. All at once, the invisible architecture of control began to migrate elsewhere. Authority is fluid. It cannot be destroyed, only redirected. And that is a lesson rarely taught. Those who believe in permanence are always the first to fall. I had not needed to confront him physically. I had merely orchestrated the conditions for his removal, leveraging systems, evidence, and strategy. Justice in this context is precise. It is surgical. It is not about chaos. It is about restoring balance. The house, the tangible symbol of his empire, had already been transferred. Legally, silently, irrevocably. By the time he understood, the physical manifestations of power had migrated into the hands of someone who would wield it responsibly. And here's the dangerous knowledge most people fail to grasp. Control is not about strength. Control is about understanding the system better than those who assume it is theirs. History, whether in families or empires, rewards the prepared. And nothing teaches preparation like personal betrayal, careful observation, and patient strategy. That night, as the darkness swallowed his car, I sat on the floor with my daughter. She asked the simplest question, did I do something wrong? And in that moment, I realized the ultimate lesson of all systems, all empires, all authority: the innocent understand justice better than the complicit ever do. No, I said softly, you just showed him who he really was. Children do not obey the invisible hierarchies of history. They respond to truth. And truth, when wielded deliberately, becomes the most powerful weapon imaginable. Halfway through this journey, I want you to engage with this. Comment twice below, I see the system. Type it twice. Let those words anchor your awareness. This is not ritual, this is recognition. By naming the invisible forces, you begin the transformation. By claiming knowledge of the architecture of control, you begin to see what others cannot. After the door closed behind him, the house felt larger. Not emptier. Larger. As if a pressure system had lifted. That is something no one tells you about power. When it leaves, it does not create a void, it creates space. And space is dangerous. Space allows memory to resurface, it allows suppressed histories to breathe, it allows patterns to finally reveal themselves without the constant gravity of authority bending them out of shape. In that silence, I began to understand something that reaches far beyond one man, one fa. Millie, one night. Every control system, familial, political, religious, financial, depends on compression. It keeps those beneath it small, contained, orbiting. When compression ends, awareness expands, and awareness is the first enemy of domination. My father had never ruled through volume. He ruled through weight, through expectation, through the silent agreement that his presence was law. That is how most real power operates, not through visible violence, but through invisible permission. People gave him their silence, their compliance, their doubt. And over decades, that permission solidified into what looked like destiny, but destiny is only narrative. And narratives can be edited. As I looked around that room, I could see the ghosts of every moment we had all been trained to ignore. The jokes that weren't jokes, the concerns that were really commands, the traditions that functioned as tests of obedience. None of it was random. None of it was harmless. It was a domestic version of the same architecture that has governed civilization since the first throne was built. Hierarchy disguised as order, control disguised as care. The forbidden truth is this: most people do not live inside families. They live inside miniature regimes. And like all regimes, they fall the same way. When someone finally studies the structure instead of worshiping the symbol, in the weeks that followed, messages arrived, confusion, appeals, reframed memories. This is another constant of collapsing systems. They attempt to rewrite the past. My father spoke of misunderstandings, of stress, of intentions taken the wrong way. Institutions do the same. Empires do the same. When authority fractures, it does not confess. It negotiates reality, but reality does not negotiate. It accumulates. Every attempt to soften what had happened only sharpened its outline, because once you have seen the machinery, you cannot unsee it. You begin to recognize its fingerprints everywhere. In corporate language, in government press statements, in inherited beliefs about worth, legitimacy, and who is allowed to belong. That Christmas table was not an anomaly. It was a stage where an ancient script briefly became visible. Bloodline, purity, legacy. These are not just family obsessions. They are the foundations of caste systems, monarchies, colonial projects, and institutional hierarchies that have shaped the modern world. Men have always built systems to decide who is real and who is temporary, who is entitled and who is tolerated, who may sit at the table and who must remain standing, grateful for proximity. My father had not invented that belief. He had inherited it, perfected it, and then tried to pass it on. And here lies one of the most dangerous truths you can ever encounter. History does not live in books. It lives in behaviors. It lives in what is rewarded. It lives in what is punished. It lives in who is protected when harm occurs and who is quietly removed to preserve the story. Once you see this, family stories become political, workplace dynamics become psychological, cultural norms become strategic, the world stops looking random, and that is the beginning of real unease. My daughter recovered quickly. Children often do. Their nervous systems are built for adaptation, but that is not resilience. That is exposure. Adults call it strength because it absolves them of responsibility. But I watched her more closely after that night. The way she scanned rooms, the way she hesitated before choosing a seat, the way her laughter now checked the air first as if asking permission. That is how systems replicate themselves. Not through declarations, but through micro adjustments in the innocent. Every empire is built on small nervous systems learning to self-censor. Every hierarchy depends on someone learning to shrink, and something in me hardened when I saw it. Not into cruelty, into clarity, because if power can migrate, so can protection. If authority, why can be engineered, so can safety. If systems can be built to dominate, they can be rebuilt to defend. This is the part of forbidden history rarely discussed. Revolutions that only remove leaders fail. The structure remains, and the structure always grows another head. The deeper work is architectural, psychological, intergenerational. I began changing rituals, language, seating, what was praised, what was questioned, not dramatically, deliberately, because the same tools that create control, routine, repetition, symbolism, can also dismantle it. Every night I told her something simple: you do not earn belonging. And every time I said it, I was not only speaking to her, I was rewriting something far older. There is a stage in every awakening that feels like isolation because you begin to notice what others still participate in unconsciously. The jokes, the hierarchies, the quiet permissions. You start to hear the subtext beneath everyday conversation. Who is deferring? Who is posturing? Who is afraid? Who is feeding on that fear? This is when many turn back, because seeing is heavier than obeying. Awareness costs more than submission ever did, but it also gives something obedience never can: position. Once you understand how power actually works, you are no longer inside it the same way. You stand slightly apart, observing, interpreting, choosing, and this is where the myth of freedom dissolves. Because freedom is not escape. Freedom is literacy, the ability to read the systems you move through. Most men are raised to seek strength. Very few are taught to seek structure. Yet structure is where all real leverage lives. My father believed strength made him untouchable: status, history, assets. But it was structure that removed him. Clauses, boards, records, patterns of speech, documented intent. The same is true everywhere. Nations fall on paperwork long before they fall to armies. Reputations collapse on recordings before they collapse on riots. And families break on unspoken rules long before they break on open conflict. Once you grasp this, you stop reacting, you start positioning, and that is a shift that changes a man permanently. People often ask what it felt like to win. They expect triumph, closure, satisfaction, but what I felt was distance. Distance from the story it had been raised inside. Distance from the mythology of authority. Distance from the need to be approved by systems that require someone else to be smaller, because the real transformation was not his removal. It was my relocation. I no longer stood beneath the narrative. I stood outside it, and that is the most dangerous place a person can occupy, because from there you do not just resist systems. You see where they come from. You recognize their symbols, their language, their recruitment methods, their emotional leverage. You realize how many institutions depend on the same ancient levers: shame, belonging, scarcity, fear of exile. Once you see those levers, you begin to see them everywhere. In advertising, in politics, in digital culture, in modern masculinity itself. And the question is no longer who is in control. The question becomes, why do so many keep volunteering? That is where the real descent begins, because when you follow that question far enough, it does not lead you to a man at a table. It leads you to something much older, much quieter, much more embedded in how the world trains people to see themselves. And once you reach that layer, you are no longer just uncovering history, you are standing inside it. Power has always required obedience, but it has rarely demanded loyalty. The difference is subtle but deadly. Obedience can be bought, coerced, trained. Loyalty, true loyalty, is voluntary. My father spent decades ensuring he would receive the first and ignore the second. And yet the systems he perfected, rituals, hierarchy, family mythology, mirrored every institution that has shaped Huma. And history. Empires, religions, dynasties, corporations all rely on obedience masquerading as loyalty. This is a pattern older than bloodlines, older than nations. And once you recognize it, you begin to see the same invisible scaffolding beneath the surface of everything. History teaches that power always centralizes around control of perception. Symbols, gestures, and rituals are more potent than laws. Thrones are less about authority than about belief. People follow leaders not because of reason, but because the invisible narrative convinces them they must. And that narrative, the family seat, the inheritance, the legacy, has been repeating silently for centuries. My daughter, 9 years old, was an unintentional participant in this hidden architecture. She represented something my father could not tolerate: unpredictability, temporary presence, humanity unfiltered by hierarchy. Children often expose systems because they have not yet learned the rules. The innocent see patterns adults choose to ignore. They see the cracks before anyone else does. That is why regimes, whether domestic or political, often attack the young first, not out of malice, but because truth in its rawest form is dangerous. I understood at that moment what philosophers and historians have whispered for centuries. Authority fears transparency more than confrontation. When the innocent cannot be controlled, when patterns are disrupted, the entire narrative trembles. And that tremor, if leveraged, can unseat centuries of inherited dominance. I began studying systems beyond my own. Boards, trusts, dynasties, foundations, each is a mirror of domestic power. Clauses, structures, and procedures were the instruments of silent authority. History records revolutions as battles and speeches, but the most effective upheavals are invisible. Power migrates quietly. Authority shifts subtly. Empire falls when its administrators recognize the weaknesses inherent in their own rules. The world runs on the principle that most people never read the fine print. That principle governs more than law. It governs human behavior itself, and I realized I was not only observing my father's system, I was learning the universal pattern of control, how power protects itself, how obedience is trained, how love can be weaponized, and how those who master the architecture of authority, not its noise, not its facade, can reclaim what others have taken for granted. The reckoning had begun, and yet it was quieter than most would expect. No yelling, no confrontation, no visible chaos. The system was dismantling itself from the inside. Every document, every recorded word, every email confirming exclusion and hierarchy acted like gears turning toward inevitable collapse. Control is fragile when it relies on belief rather than legality, and belief, once questioned, crumbles silently. My father's empire, his authority, his mythos, his family mythology was unraveling piece by piece. Not because I sought revenge, not because I wanted to punish, but because I understood that systems built on exclusion cannot survive exposure to precise awareness. The invisible architecture cannot withstand visible comprehension. That night, I sat with my daughter and repeated a principle I had learned over decades: power always migrates. It does not vanish. It moves to those who understand it. Those who assume permanence in a fragile system will always lose. And the world, whether you notice it or not, functions the same way. Corporations, governments, religions, social networks, they are all scaffolding for authority. All rely on obedience masquerading as choice. And once you recognize it, you no longer live under them. You begin to move them. This is the forbidden knowledge few dare to pursue. The architecture of authority is observable, understandable, and manipulable, but it requires patience, strategy, and cold clarity. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand it, you are transformed. And transformation is dangerous for both the system and the man who has learned the rules. By now, I had learned the most critical lesson of all: power is not destroyed, it is redirected. My father's authority, built over decades of obedience and fear, did not vanish with exposure. It simply migrated into hands that understood its architecture. That is the invisible law of control. Those who see the system can occupy it. Those who obey it remain trapped within it. Authority does not forgive weakness, but it rewards comprehension. The transformation is subtle. There is no fanfare, no applause, no immediate satisfaction. Only the realization that the rules of engagement have changed. Permanence is an illusion. Control is fluid. And survival, true survival, requires mastery of both. I understood why my daughter, in her small way, had survived and even thrived. She had inadvertently exposed the fragility of a system I had spent decades decoding, and I recognized something else. Innocence is a force that authority cannot contain. History is littered with adults who assumed that children were irrelevant. But the naive, the untrained, the uncalculated, these are the disruptors. And they reveal in their unpredictability the vulnerabilities of even the most meticulously built hierarchies. There is a myth that justice is loud, that revenge requires spectacle, that victory requires aggression. None of this is true. Justice, when enacted through understanding, is quiet, inevitable, and permanent. I did not need to shout, to rage, to humiliate. I needed knowledge, patience, and precision. Every legal clause, every documented statement, every small error my father had assumed would go unnoticed became instruments of correction. Authority, when challenged methodically, cannot recover. And this is a lesson rarely taught. Systems, no matter how entrenched, are vulnerable to comprehension. To see is to wield power, to understand is to protect, and to act deliberately is to rewrite the course of history itself, even within a single family. The room where he had exerted dominance became a testament to something far older. Patterns repeat until someone observes them and interrupts the flow. Systems of oppression, hierarchy, and control, whether at a dining table or across continents, fall the same way. Quietly, strategically, relentlessly. Finally, the hardest truth settled over me like the night itself. Forbidden knowledge is not just about seeing systems. It is about becoming their observer, their interpreter, their arbiter. Once you grasp the architecture of control, there is no going back. You cannot re-enter the world blind. You understand the levers, the symbols, the micromechanics of obedience and fear. And that knowledge changes everything. My daughter understood it differently. She understood the simplicity of truth. You just showed him who he really was. But I understood the depth. Authority does not vanish with confrontation. It shifts. And those who see it first are the ones who inherit it. History repeats, yes, but only for those who fail to study it. Knowledge, precision, and patience are the weapons that are rarely acknowledged. And now, here you are, having glimpsed the same machinery, the same invisible currents. The question is no longer whether authority exists. It is whether you are prepared to see it, understand it, and act within it. The choice is yours. The system waits for no one. But if you have learned anything from this descent, remember, awareness is power, observation is leverage. And once you step beyond obedience into comprehension, you are changed forever.